So I bought this Nvidia's flagship graphics card from 2012, the GTX 690, and to be honest, I kinda regret buying it. From what we're about to see in 2024. This GPU or GPUs can't really cut it in modern gaming. This video is brought to you by Fifine and their AM8 dynamic microphone. No matter if you're a budding streamer or content creator, or if you need that extra audio quality in party chat, Fifine's AM8 has you covered. Featuring both an XLR and USB-C input, along with a 3.5mm headphone jack for headphone pass-through. Gain control and headphone volume can be adjusted with the dials on the front of the microphone, and switching to the back there is a tap to mute button. RGB lighting is present and it's customizable via a button on the front of the microphone, so you can suit the lighting to your style. For more information, check out the AM8 down in the description below. The GTX 690 hails from a different time. This is when Nvidia with their 90 class graphics cards were basically gluing two 80 class GPUs together on a single board. So unlike the RTX 3090 and 4090, which have a single GPU on the board, this has two of them. And back then this was kind of cool because this means you could SLI with a single graphics card. So if you had a motherboard which wasn't technically SLI capable, you could still do it with this GPU. Judging by the fact that this costed $1,000 back then and SLI support was kind of dodgy even back then, means that the 90 class dual GPUs were kind of just not that successful, and Nvidia finally ditched them in favour for the 80 Ti and Titan graphics cards, which were a lot more successful. But regardless, how does this GPU or GPUs get on in 2024? To find out, I've tested at 1080p and in the case of one game 768p in my gaming PC today. Due to weird legacy issues, it wouldn't work in my test bench. But my gaming PC has a Ryzen 5 8600G, 32GB of 6000MHz CL30 DDR5 memory, a 2TB NVMe Gen 4 SSD, and a GB B650M Gaming X-AX motherboard. The latest driver has been used at the time of testing, which is a very old driver because this GPU is based on Kepler, and it's been left at its stock out of the box settings. So let's see how it gets on. Starting off with an SLI supported title in Battlefield 1. Here the average frame rate was quite decent on the medium preset, getting just shy of 90 FPS, but SLI does seem to hamper that 1% low by quite a bit, as it got almost half of the average frame rate. This means that the frame time is all over the place and the frame pacing isn't necessarily consistent, and this did translate to just the mouse feeling weird in this game. So is it playable? Yeah. Is it ideal? No, not really. Where things do get unplayable though is in Cyberpunk 2077, because 20 FPS on average with 16 FPS for the 1% low on the low preset isn't brilliant performance at all. Here SLI isn't working as Cyberpunk doesn't support it, so it's just one of the GTX 680s going at it here. So yeah, the 690 is not very good in Cyberpunk. Where it is somewhat decent though is in Fortnite with the Performance API. Here you can get a very competitive frame rate of 138. That 1% low though isn't looking particularly brilliant with 65 FPS there. So the frame rate isn't necessarily the most consistent here, but you could probably play Fortnite on a GTX 690. Where things get pretty brutal for this graphics card is Red Dead Redemption 2. Opening it brought up this warning error with the drivers, which is probably to be expected with a Kepler graphics card, but I had to drop down the resolution to 768p due to VRAM requirements, as the 2GB isn't even good enough for low textures at 1080p. So 768p it was, and the performance here is not brilliant at all. 20 FPS on average is not great performance, I don't care who you ask. The Witcher 3 on the medium preset with DirectX 11 enabled saw pretty decent performance, getting above 60 FPS on average with SLI working and scaling pretty well in this title. I saw no major issues while benchmarking. Maybe the 1% low is quite a bit off as from what we've seen with basically every other game today, but The Witcher 3 is playable on the medium preset. I mean, the 680 did a decent job here. This graphics card was 1 year old when GTA 5 launched on the Xbox 360 and PS3, and it was about, I would like to say, 3 years old when it launched on PC. However, with the high preset and low textures thanks to the 2GB of VRAM, decent performance was achievable today, getting south of 100 FPS on average with a 1% low, which follows the trend of every other game today being basically half of the average frame rate. I mean, performance is definitely playable in GTA 5. The biggest issue here is obviously the textures, and yeah, that 2GB of VRAM per GPU really doesn't help out at all. So all in all, the GTX 690 is kind of just meh. When it plays games, it plays them quite well despite the weird 1% low issues which we saw with the SLI today. And in newer games, you're not really going to have that much of a chance because it's likely that only one of the GPUs is going to work due to the lack of SLI, and that's even if it starts it as with every other single Kepler graphics card ever released. This only supports DirectX 12 at, well, a software level and not a feature level. So games like God of War won't even start on this graphics card due to it just being too old. And then, if the lack of DirectX 12 feature level support doesn't get you, the lack of driver support will. As drivers for this thing, they stopped like 3 years ago now, so it's getting on quite a bit now. And even then, if either of these weren't an issue, the performance is not going to be great. Like, look at Red Dead Redemption 2 and Cyberpunk today. The performance was pretty woeful. Conversely though, if you're one for older AAA games from anywhere up to about 2016, the GTX 690 does a relatively decent job. I like games like Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 4, and here they performed very well for the most part. Despite the 1% low performance, I believe it's still a very playable experience, even though there was like some weird input with the mouse that I'm not quite used to. I'm not sure if that's me or the graphics card or maybe even SLI itself, to be honest, but the games were playable, and from what you could probably see from the gameplay, I wasn't playing terribly. Maybe, that's probably just on me anyway. And this is why I think this graphics card should be left in history, because performance in older games is still pretty decent. Of course, it's going to be not that much has changed since when this had launched and those games. And obviously, newer gaming performance is not great at all. Even in the sort of the esports games, the performance was well below what I was expecting. Is it a core graphics card? Yes. Is it a practical one? Certainly not by any stretch of the imagination. Because for the £60 that I paid for this GPU, you could always buy something like a used GTX 1060 6GB, RX 580 8GB, or even, if you're really lucky, a GTX 1660 or 1660 Super. All of these graphics cards will healthily outperform this GPU, and you don't have to put up with any of the SLI nonsense, as they are all single GPU graphics cards, which is pretty normal, to be honest. And of course, they support DirectX 12.0 at least at a feature level, and they are all still supported kind of in the case of the RX 580, but regardless, even in the case of the 580, support is a lot better on these GPUs than it is on this one. Oh, and they'll also consume a lot less power than this, because each GPU on this was consuming around 120 watts when SLI was scaling properly. And speaking of SLI, I can kind of see why it was abandoned by Nvidia, because it's just not really that good. When both GPUs scale, it works quite well despite the weird 1% lows, which admittedly could be just because it's two GTX 680s instead of, I don't know, like two 2080 Ti's or something like that. But SLI is so finicky and the support was so patchy for it, I can't blame Nvidia for dropping it. Yes, it was cool, but it was certainly impractical. Back then, I would have rather just got something like a GTX 780 Ti than two GTX 770s or something along those lines, because that was just a lot more practical. You're only relying on one graphics card and you're not at the sort of the mercy of the game developers' optimization and their implementation of the technology. So I can kind of see why Nvidia dropped this technology. And when it comes to this, performance without the second GPU across the games tested today was pretty diabolical, so that's why this GPU is best left off in history. But if you want to see a good value used graphics card, there's a video right up there for you, and I'll catch you in the next one.